We all know Adobe, and many of us rely on Adobe's software in our daily jobs. From Photoshop to Premiere to After Effects and everything in between, Adobe has cornered the market on creative software. Now, whether that's a good or bad thing, we'll get to later in this video, but let's have a quick summary as to where Adobe's at now, and we'll go back as to how they got there. Adobe have an estimated 30 million customers currently willing to pay for the right to use their software, with their profit from 2023 alone approximately standing at around $5.4 billion US. Now that's not unearned, they have legitimately paved the way for modern visual design and helped create the desktop publishing revolution with some of their software. But today, in 2024, as we'll get to in more detail later, a lot of people are pissed off and wanting to jump ship.
Well, it's official. I have severed all ties with Adobe. I've ended an almost 40-year relationship.
Even though Photoshop is like my lifeblood, it's one of the first programs I got good at and is largely responsible for me being here today, I'm so happy to not be using it anymore.
It almost feels like the entire world of corporate America and big tech is trying to speedrun its way into absolutely pissing off its entire customer base.
On their path to creating and controlling a global creative monopoly, what has Adobe done to breed such resentment amongst their own customers and the online creative world as a whole? This is the story of the rise and fall of Adobe. And many of you watching this will already know plenty of reasons why creative professionals and hobbyists might be pissed off at Adobe. And we'll get to that, but I want to start with the rise of Adobe. Adobe was founded in 1982 by engineers who had the idea that professionals needed more accessible publishing and printing software. So in 1983, they released PostScript.
Take this one down to accounting, print it out on the laser printer. Take this one up to the 5th floor, print it out at 1200 DPI.
Wouldn't it be a lot easier if we just standardized on PostScript?
And very quickly, Adobe started influencing industry standards. Their early success owing both to the fact that they made competent programs, but also that they were the first professional programs to the market. And from there, they grew. Now, in these early days, in only a 5-year period, Adobe created or acquired 4 of the most influential, groundbreaking, and long-lasting creative programs in history. Illustrator in 1987, Photoshop in 1988, Premiere in 1991, and Acrobat in 1993. But in the same period, there was a competitor, Aldus Corporation, who pioneered desktop publishing in their PageMaker software that would later pave the way for InDesign, image editing, including the creation of tag image file format, known as TIFF, and video production in After Effects. So in 1994, Adobe and Aldus were sitting in a tree. MERGING. The company then doubled in size to become the 5th largest software company in the world. It was already moving quick for Adobe, but from this point on, it just snowballed into total monopoly. In 2003, Adobe bundled all of their products together in Adobe's Creative Suite to unify their branding and start tying their products together. Photoshop's previous release, which was titled version 7, was now released along with their new other software under the new family title CS, followed by CS2, CS3, and so on. Adobe started breaking the $1 billion mark in revenue around the time they started to bundle their software, making it more appealing to the market and dramatically reducing the pulling power of any other competitors that cropped up. Oh, you're looking at that Paint Shop Pro? Well, Photoshop comes with Acrobat and Illustrator for a similar price, so there's no point. Just kill them. Now, in reality, it's a very good business strategy. They continued to corner all of these creative markets and also had a reputation for buying other creative companies that were competitors, which did at one point result in the FCC blocking one of those purchases because of a fear of monopolization. But Adobe continued to acquire products at the very least, either to integrate into their own platform or to simply stop development so that their products wouldn't have any more competition. And speaking of cornering the markets and acquisitions, Adobe acquired Macromedia in 2005, which along with now owning Flash, Dreamweaver, and Cold Fusion, among other things, gave Adobe a very tight grip on the then booming web development market. It's a pretty quick and aggressive story of the rise of Adobe, where really essentially nothing got in their way and they continued to grow when by 2013, Adobe was clearly the unchallenged dominant force in the market. And in 2013, they made a controversial change to their product line, which marks a turning point in both the decisions the company would make moving forward and how their customers started to feel resentment towards their new creative overlords. A move I would think in hindsight is the most tangible mark of the beginning of the fall. 2013 marked the biggest turning point in Adobe history. Adobe released the Creative Cloud to take the place of the Creative Suite, announcing that all future versions of their Creative Suite apps would only be available for purchase through a subscription-based service, only available on the cloud. The service changed the full suite's price from a one-time purchase of $1,800 to a $50 a month purchase for the same Creative Suite in an ongoing way. Now, on the surface and in the short term, this meant much more affordable creative software for their millions of customers. But when you go under that surface level, the deeper impact means the retraction of a customer's right to own the software that they use. And it sets the precedent of trapping customers in a vicious cycle of being forced to continue to pay for software for which there are no alternatives. But as we see with many other companies that make controversial moves that a lot of people don't like, all you have to do is wait through the initial controversy and you'll end up getting the paying customers you wanted in the first place. All they had to do was keep their competition to a minimum and they stay at the top. And the way this normally happens is with those acquisitions, because if you can't beat them, eat them, which Adobe are very good at doing. And in fact, here's just a short list. And without any solid competition or anywhere else for their customers to go, there really wasn't a lot Adobe had to do to force their customers to keep paying them. And as a result, many customers complained about experiencing diminishing quality and stability in pretty much any program that isn't Photoshop. Now that's all a very external look at Adobe and the sort of thing that you'll see in plenty of YouTube videos. But I want to go on to share a little bit more of my direct personal observations and experience with Adobe, because I have worked with them several points in the past and have experienced their workplaces and culture. And as someone who very much began an enthusiastic Adobe fanboy and has grown to become quite resentful and frustrated with them myself, I guess I wanted to share my experience because it at least encapsulates my journey through that process from a fairly close observational perspective.
But the main reason for this video, essentially those who use the Adobe products know that they can be expensive. They've bought out a system which is where you can pay by month for a subscription and get all of their master collection. If you're interested, go check it out. Go to adobe.com and check out the Creative Cloud Suite thing. I would highly recommend it. It's a great opportunity to get into using professional grade software without being poor. As a broke artist trying to make ends meet, when Creative Cloud came out, I couldn't afford $400 for Flash or Photoshop, let alone $1,800 for the Creative Suite. So I had up until then been using pirated, dodgy versions of the software. Let's face it, most people in the early days of the internet did. So when the Creative Cloud was launched, I was actually personally on board. And in fact, it gave me a path to legitimacy as someone seeking to be a working professional that I otherwise couldn't have afforded. I could do $40 a month and got the whole Creative Suite as a result. So I was on board. Suffice it to say, I was initially an advocate for this change, especially since at the time I used many of their programs on a daily basis and they were the foundation of my ability to develop a career on YouTube and in art and animation. In the years following the transition into the Creative Cloud, I was pretty content personally. And while I never had any issues with Photoshop, I did find some of the other programs that I was learning to lean on more and more, such as Premiere and Flash, were becoming less and less reliable.
Which is going to be a theme park thing. What's happening? No, don't crash! This is the opposite of what needs to happen. That's okay. Animate saved a file called recover spirited away. It's exactly the same. Hasn't recovered anything. Great. Now what? What is going on?
And new features started to feel more half-baked or even broken. Still, I was pretty loyal to Adobe. I created hundreds of video tutorials on how to use Flash, Photoshop, and more. And in fact, this was a huge part of how my channel gained traction. I was one of the first reliable sources of video tutorials for art programs on YouTube, and this helped me carve out a name for myself. I kind of became the Flash guy or art tutorial guy on YouTube, specifically for Adobe digital programs. Anyone who wanted to learn to animate in Flash inevitably found my tutorial content, and in fact, I would receive contacts every week from people showing my tutorials being played in their high school or university multimedia or animation classes. And this influence obviously rippled all the way to Adobe, because in 2016, I was contacted by them directly. They reached out to inform me that they were going to relaunch and rebrand Adobe Flash as Adobe Animate and invited me to participate in the launch. And I was 100% on board and excited, especially because I had started to feel like Flash was unsupported and left to die. People were saying Flash is dead, especially because iOS and Apple didn't support it. But hearing that Adobe was actually going to give more attention and effort to craft this program I'd grown to love and depend on into a full-fledged animation suite was something I was dying to hear. So I proceeded to work with Adobe directly a few times. First with the launch and rebranding of Adobe Animate, where I went to their headquarters in San Francisco and did some streaming and got to tour the place and meet some of the higher ups, and it was a really cool and interesting experience. I revisited the HQ another time, I think a year later, and I was also on a separate occasion invited to be a speaker at Adobe Max, their business-centric convention, where I also got to meet in person with Ajay Shukla, the head of the Adobe Animate product. He was running that show, and I couldn't have been more excited. But with my experiences in person with Adobe over those years, I couldn't help but notice a fragmentation in the priorities of how Adobe developed their software. I mean, that's not surprising. Every company has their darling product. And for Adobe, it's Photoshop. And if you're in the San Francisco headquarters, it is clear that is the big show. Photoshop is their darling. It's the thing that is, I guess, their biggest moneymaker and also their most supported product. But most other software were developed in other offices, and much of them, especially the most outsourced ones like Flash, now Animate, were outsourced and developed in India. Now, I don't think it's necessary to really comment on how a large company prioritizes and spends its budgets and on how it, develops software. But at the same time, it's clear as a user of the software that you get a different level of treatment. But even more importantly, I found through my experience working with Adobe that their alignment with what the customers of the product wanted was way off. There was a lot of talk of new and experimental features in Animate, many of which were entirely unnecessary, like a period in which they were developing VR tools for Animate. Essentially, just create the content the way you normally would and wrap it in a 360-degree cylinder to view in VR. Meanwhile, the biggest point of contention for professionals and people who use the software was that the basics were broken. The vector brushes that were once beloved in Flash had just become crap and near unusable. My friend and incredible animator James Lee said of the brushes, "The Animate brush has been a problem for a long time. It's improved considerably from where it was several years ago, but only because at one stage it had taken such a huge step backwards. I don't believe the brush ever achieved a professional state anywhere near any other vector software. The brush still breaks a lot, and like most features in Animate, it's still half-baked and incomplete." Now, while I don't have any juicy scandals or tea to spill from my time at Adobe, I can say from personal experience, there was a real sense of self-importance amongst Adobe as a whole. Like the ideas that the people working on the software were the best ideas, and that didn't really feel like as customers or contributors, like you were being really heard or taken seriously. And I would guess that's because new shiny features, whether they're relevant or not to the existing customer base, are way more exciting to shareholders than to the current users. And shareholders certainly feel like they take precedence when, as a user, you're saying this basic is broken. Please fix it. There's a new, but that's broken too. Oh, it crashed. And I also experienced that Adobe uses the Apple method of marketing, essentially leaning on the passion of its user base. I learned this because I was their passionate user base, and I was very cheap marketing. And many of the other creators that I met through the years that I worked with and went to Adobe felt the same and offered their services, their platforms, and their work to Adobe at very cheap or free rates, simply for the honor of working with the giant. Now, it's not surprising, and it's why Apple markets in this way, because if you have a ravenously passionate user base, why not let them use their passion and market and work for you essentially for free? And when that's a two-way relationship, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. But it's when it starts to become an expectation of the company that it becomes gross. In a forum post to volunteer testers at the time of the launch of Animate, the head of Adobe Animate said, "The first ever release of Adobe Animate CC is just around the corner. You've been an excellent partner in helping us redesign the tool. Now help us promote it as well. This is your time to show your allegiance to the product and assist us when it counts. We will obviously acknowledge your work in the above material. If that's not enough, we will have a token remuneration for your work. If that's still not enough, you will have my personal gratitude and appreciation." This was posted to working professionals who were already volunteering their time to provide feedback to make the software they're using better. So they're getting something out of it, hopefully, if they make the program usable. I can't help but interpret that message as an attempt to pressure working professionals into providing their professional quality and standard of work to Adobe for free or at a very low cost for Adobe to use in whatever way they want to promote their new product. I mean, you would think, as the world's biggest creative software company with billions of dollars of profit, they might prioritize putting some of that to paying creative professionals who actually advocate for and make their products desirable to people. Now, I did get paid by Adobe, but the work I provided for them was at a massive discount for my rates at the time. In part because I didn't want to miss out on working with them. They're the biggest and kind of only legitimate creative software company in the world at the time. My hope was to over-provide value so they'd lock me in at a fairer rate in the future. 2 years after initially working with them, the head of the product reached out to collaborate with me again. At that time, I had an agent who could handle getting me fair prices, which I wasn't really equipped to do myself, I guess, with the hopes that they could secure a fair rate for my future work with Adobe. I never heard from Adobe again. And when I asked my agent about what happened there, he said, "I'm trying my best, but the initial feedback that I've received is that the amount is too high for similar efforts in the past." In other words, I was cheap in the past, but not worth my fair price. I think that gave me the message loud and clear as to how Adobe likes to work with people. I personally think this is the symptom of a company that thinks they're unbeatable. And because there's no other competition and they hold such a stranglehold on the market, artists and creators should consider themselves even lucky being acknowledged by said company, let alone paying them, which is a pretty odd attitude considering they're companies that purport to empower creatives. Speaking of prioritizing cheap outcomes over rewarding hardworking talent, let's talk about AI. Specifically, the latest and greatest scandal at Adobe so far. According to the terms and conditions contract, all customers must agree to allow Adobe full access to their Creative Cloud projects, and there is no option to limit or decline that access. Now, while I'm sure when a company slips stuff like that in their terms and conditions, they hope it goes by unnoticed and they can go about rummaging around whatever data they want. But this was obviously found out and a huge deal for a lot of people, many of which were professionals whose work is under various NDA or careful ownership or trademark agreements. Let's say artists at Disney use Photoshop in their workflow, which I assume they do. Adobe is foregoing any conversation about IP or ownership and forcing its users to agree to have their work be accessed and potentially trained on by Adobe. So logically, many people for whom this was a deal breaker wanted to walk away. Problem is, they couldn't. When notified of these changes, customers weren't given the option to cancel their subscription. In fact, their only option was to click agree and continue. They couldn't even uninstall the software without agreeing to the terms and conditions of this new contract. Well, let's say you click sign and agree just so you can get through to canceling your subscription. Well, if you have been a Creative Cloud member for under 12 months, Well, now you have to pay. You're hit with a cancellation fee because it's not a monthly contract. It's monthly payments to a yearly contract. So you're obligated to pay for at least the whole year, even if you only use a month or two. Now, in 2024, Adobe is being sued by the US federal government because they believe that Adobe's heavy termination fees are harming customers. They also say that Adobe forces subscribers who want to cancel online to navigate unnecessarily through numerous pages, while those canceling by phone are often disconnected or forced to repeat themselves to multiple representatives and encounter, quote, resistance and delay from those representatives. Samuel Levine, director of the FTC Consumer Protection Bureau, said, quote, Adobe trapped customers into year-long subscriptions through hidden early termination fees and numerous cancellation hurdles. Side note, there's a great rant from Linus Tech Tips on their podcast about how Adobe does the same screwy stuff with their corporate product.
When we were growing at a pretty steady clip, one of the things that you have to do is you have to add seats to your Adobe Creative Cloud subscription, right? But then one day something bizarre happened. For the first time in forever, our headcount in the editing department or in the one of the creative departments went down by 1. I was the administrator of our Adobe account at the time, and I was like, well, surely this is no problem. I will simply go in and you can't remove a seat. And when you're an organization that has a bunch of seats, when you add another seat, you can't cancel it. I think you can pay an early termination fee. But that blew my mind.
In response to the growing public concern to the TNC changes, Adobe released a statement to clarify. To be clear, Adobe requires a limited license to access content solely for the purpose of operating or improving these services and software. These services and software and enforce our terms and comply with law, such as protect against abusive content. Adobe then reinforces that Adobe does not train Firefly Gen AI models on customer content, and Adobe will never assume ownership of a customer's work. However, in all practicality, clicking agree to a terms and conditions document is the legal equivalent of signing a legal contract. The terms of that contract supersede any clarification a CEO might say, because you've signed it. A legal document that states, our systems may analyze your content and Creative Cloud customer fonts using techniques such as machine learning in order to improve our services and software and user experience. And while Adobe may clarify that they do not train Gen AI on your data, they don't have to claim that they won't, because they will. I mean, why else did they put that in there in the first place? They already had plenty of paths to improving their product. This is not about improving their product. This is about your data. And the best data you have for Adobe is the stuff you make. So all they need is that.
Now, I'm just adding this little addendum in here. While editing this video, Adobe announced the release of new generative AI video features with Adobe Firefly. Now, in that release, they state really clearly in the video,
our video model is designed to be commercially safe and is only trained on public domain or licensed content.
So clearly they're trying to be very, very specific about not using user data to train AI. While of course this is welcome to a lot of people, it's also a little bit too little too late in the sense that intentions seemed very clearly shown, and to many, including myself, feels like only a matter of time before abusing everyone's data is so ubiquitous that they can get their sticky fingers on it again. But only time will tell. Regardless, I think it's safe to say that Adobe had broken people's trust in a way that's pretty hard to recover from.
Adobe has proven time and time again, in the last few decades especially, that shareholders take precedence over paying customers, and that their profits and maintaining a grip on their monopoly takes priority over the creatives who pay them. The harm they've done to the goodwill they once held in the eyes of creatives like me is, in my view, irreversible. So, what happens from here? Well, believe it or not, there's actually kind of a happy ending, because Adobe isn't the only thing you need to use anymore. I'm going to link in the description to a GitHub post that's really cool and outlines a whole bunch of different alternatives to pretty much every major Adobe program, many of which are open source or free. So there are plenty of options for artists now. And I want to speak to a few of those from my personal experience that I feel like I have some actual thoughts on. The biggest one is DaVinci Resolve. Anytime I speak to anyone and I hear they're using Premiere, not a fan. I used Premiere for so many years and it's like, even looking at it now makes me feel like a caveman. DaVinci Resolve is so much better and it's free. It's absurd. It's too good to be true, but it's true. This video is not sponsored by DaVinci Resolve. They have sponsored me in the past because I went to them and say, hey, do you want to sponsor me? Because I love what you do. And guess what? They paid me fairly. How cool are they? Like, they're honestly one of the best companies I've ever worked with ever, because they genuinely support creatives. They are genuinely passionate about one thing: providing video creators with incredible tools, be it cameras or switching stations or software, which is free. Broadcast quality, studio quality, everything is astounding and I love them and I highly recommend them. And if you're using Premiere, please, for the love of God, just give yourself 2 days. That's all you need to do. Change your shortcut keys, copy the shortcut keys in DaVinci Resolve from what you used to in Premiere, and within 2 days, you'll never look back. Guarantee it. I'll link to them in the description. For Photoshop, it's a little harder, especially because some of the more niche things that keep me locked in personally. If you're an artist, an illustrator, Krita is open source and you can get it for free, and there's plenty of community support on that. But my personal recommendation is actually for Clip Studio Paint, who've also sponsored the channel at once in the past. But in my experience using that program for a full week, I was blown away by how incredible it is and how perfectly suited to artists and illustrators it is. There's so much substance there. It's really worth getting stuck into, and it's very fairly priced. For animators, Animate is don't use Adobe Animate anymore. Every time I've used it, I've been angry and depressed. I'm an old man now and I'm stuck in my ways, and I don't really animate as much as I used to, but were I starting again, I would be going to Toon Boom. And I highly recommend anyone interested in animation do the same. It's practically industry standard now with a lot of television studios, but it's also very affordable for students and beginners, with multiple options for how you can get into it and a huge depth to the program. But if you want to skim the surface and just animate simply, it can do that too. So there we have it. We've experienced the rise, the fall, and some of the alternatives. This video was, I'm gonna admit, quite cathartic. I haven't taken the opportunity to open up about this stuff much, but it's nice to let some of this off my chest. Adobe is a company that I've described in private conversations to people as a company that likes the smell of their own farts.
We're a little more progressive and ahead of the curve here in San Francisco.
That's the vibe I got from them. Don't get me wrong, there are great people at Adobe, and I have fond memories of some of the collaborations I did and some of the people I met, and I can't blame some people for working at the company, but the culture and attitude of the company as a whole is just wrong for what they purport to serve and empower. Let me know your opinions in the comments down below, because this is just mine. But if you have your own positive or negative stories or experiences regarding Adobe and their software, let me know in the comments down below, and maybe even share your experience regarding some of the alternatives that we've talked about at the end of this video. That is it for now. Thank you so much for watching. It's good to let off some steam. Until next time, I'll see you later.